Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're going to be talking about Cloak and Dagger. Before we get into that, though, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell, and leave a comment. We've got an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you guys. So thank you so much for being here. With all that said, let's dive in. So the prologue to this one is there's this villain named Renee Deladier. I hope I'm saying that right. It's French. But she calls herself Ecstasy. And in New York City, in our game, there's these different mob organizations that are always fighting each other. So there's like the Russian mob, and they're at war with the Irish mob, and they're at war with the Yakuza, and so on and so forth. And so the woman called Ecstasy has her own mob that's based out of France. And her men actually managed to take out some guys from a rival mob and steal their money. So Ecstasy's men are driving away from the scene of the crime, and they're being chased by several police cruisers. So the French villains get out a rocket launcher, and one of the guys is in the back seat. So he rolls his window down and he sits on the windowsill and he fires a rocket at the cops and hits one of the cruisers. And so the cruiser's engine compartment explodes and it flips end over end. It's very cinematic. And the cops in the other cruiser freak out and they get on the radio. And the radio chatter here, by the way, was inspired by towards the end of Terminator 2. There's the scene where they're taking out the Cyberdyne building, and Schwarzenegger like kicks a desk out of a window and he's got a minigun and he's shooting at police cars with the minigun, and they're on the radio freaking out, right? Honestly, this whole adventure was ripped off of a bunch of other stuff, and one of the things I ripped off the most was the Terminator movies. I digress. At any rate, as soon as the rocket launcher runs out of ammo, Cloak and Dagger teleport onto the hood of the moving car. Dagger does her best impression of Jackie Chan, which, by the way, I ran this like right after Rumble in the Bronx. So again, I'm just ripping off everything in this adventure. But she flips in through that open window into the back seat of the car where the guy fired the rocket from, and he's holding the empty rocket launcher. So she grabs it and smacks him in the face with it and does some damage. Meanwhile, Cloak's costume is covering the entire front windshield of the car. So the blue and black striped fabric is keeping the driver from seeing what's coming. And all the while, overhead is the X-Men's Blackbird. And so they've got a radio in the X-Jet that picks up police band radio, and they hear all that chatter I mentioned. And so the jet lowers down, and there's these bomb bay doors that open. And so we had original characters. That's what was supposed to happen in this game. It was supposed to be all original characters who had just joined the X-Men, and so on and so forth. So the original characters go down on these lines, and so then they get in on the fight, right? And so to make a long story short, the thugs get knocked out. The one guy has super strength, so he gets into the front of the car and is putting his heels on the ground, and he stops the car. And then they grab Cloak and Dagger and they go up into the Blackbird and they fly away. And so then the police show up and they find the goons have already been knocked out for them. The trunk is open with all the money, the stolen money's in there. And so the cops are kind of confused, like they thought they were going to have a shootout or something on their hands, and instead it's just kind of handed to them on a silver platter. So the NYPD are kind of standing around scratching their heads, not sure what just happened. And in the distance, you can hear that sonic boom from the jet. So that brings us to the main plot. And at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters out back, there's this basketball court, and it opens up like there's a crack at mid court, and it opens up these two big panels, revealing an underground aircraft hangar. And the Blackbird has vertol capabilities, so it can land straight down in this hangar bay, and then the basketball court seals up again. And as Cloak and Dagger, like there's stairs that fold down, kind of like a ramp. And so Cloak and Dagger are walking down these stairs, and Professor Xavier is waiting on him, and he's in his wheelchair, of course, and he welcomes them to his home. And the original characters that I mentioned earlier, they're excused at this point, and Xavier gives Cloak and Dagger a tour of the school and the dorms, which they think is awesome because up until now, they've actually been homeless and sleeping in a church in New York City. And while they're in the dorms, they meet a bunch of the sort of the new recruits of the 80s, right? So it's like Cannonball, Danny Moonstar, Karma, Magma, Siren, Sunspot, Wolf's Bane, stuff like that. And so as the characters are all getting to know each other, the other X-Men take John Redbridge, who was one of the original characters, to meet Professor Xavier. And they report to him on their last mission. And we find out that the last mission they had, they were on their way home when they picked up the police band radio. And so the last mission they had was they went up against Dracula. And in Marvel Comics, Storm and Dracula are enemies, big time, right? So Storm reports to Professor X everything that happened on the mission, and John Redbridge explains how he has been. He explains a lot of things. One is that there's this group of vampires who's trying to take over the world, and it's kind of like an Illuminati kind of a thing, but they're all vampires. And then he also explains that the reason he's been doing this supernatural stuff is because this one time he went on a Dungeons and Dragons ride at an amusement park. And there was this whirlpool, vortex thing, portal in the middle of the ride, and it transported all of the riders to a strange, faraway land with swords and sorcery. And at any rate, he leveled up a bunch there and he became an immortal. And so now he's got a bunch of weird powers that he's not really used to yet. And one of the other X-Men tells him, you know, if you've got weird powers that you're not used to, you're in the right place. But just then, the X-Men vanish. And so John Redbridge is just by himself standing there in Xavier's office wondering what just happened. And so we find out that there's a Shi'ar starship above the mansion, and it beamed him up like on Star Trek. And so Kitty Pryde had been swimming. So she asks where the water went. Cyclops had been with his dad, Corsair. They look around confused. Kitty says that she's scared, and Nightcrawler is into her. He's attracted to her, which is kind of the beginning of a big romance sort of subplot with those two characters. But he sort of hugs her and says, "I'll take care of you, Kitty." And so this character named Chancellor Erikai of the Shi'ar, he tells Professor X that, and by the way, Professor X is the royal consort of Empress Lilandra. And so recently she was at a meeting of her Grand Council, and several of her ministers were slain, and Lilandra herself was kidnapped. So Professor X is, very upset about that because he loves her, and he swears that the X-Men will find Lilandra and return her to the Shi'ar. So the professor uses telepathy to contact the students on Earth, who I mentioned earlier, that are kind of the new recruits of the 80s, right? Who, by the way, are mostly NPCs. He tells them basically that, here's what's going on. I got to go leave and do this thing. So you guys are going to be home alone. And that's kind of bad because then the next thing that happens is this villain shows up called Nimrod. And for those who didn't catch the Nimrod adventure, he's the ultimate Sentinel. He's actually from an alternate version of 2013 called The Days of Future Past. And he traveled back in time, Terminator style. Again, there's going to be so many Terminator references in this game. He came back in time, and then the events of that adventure, the way it ended was that his future would now not exist. So he was stuck here. And Nimrod's plan then in this game session is to just try to destroy the X-Men head on, right? So that's why, like, right now, he's attacking the school. So Cloak and Dagger at this point are the two actual player characters. So they try to take on Nimrod, and things get interesting. In this adventure, Dagger was played by a dear friend of mine who's no longer with us. His name was Dave Eckelberger. Dagger was one of his favorite characters of all time because her light daggers that she could shoot, like on the one hand, like let's say someone was an alcoholic, she could shoot them with a light dagger and they would no longer have any desire to drink whatsoever. Or, you know, same with smoking or drugs or anything, right? Any kind of addiction. Or it could also be like if someone was just drugged, like if like a girl was at a college party. I don't want to get dark, but you get the idea, right? Dagger could get that crap out of her system and kind of sober her up right away. But it's not only physical things. So the other thing is that her light daggers can actually change a person's alignment for the better. So if, let's say, a character was like chaotic evil, she could shoot them with a light dagger and then make them lawful good, right? Depending on how high she rolls. If she rolls high enough, she can do some pretty awesome stuff. And we decided, though, that because Nimrod is a robot, we didn't think that she would be able to affect his alignment any kind of GM fiat, you know. So, and then on Nimrod's end of things, he has the neutralize power, which means that he can temporarily negate all powers that are within one area of where he is standing right now. So the X-Men from earlier that were the original characters, they try to fight Nimrod in hand-to-hand combat, and he uses neutralize on him and then just rips him to pieces with his bare hands. Then he uses that power on Cloak, the neutralize power. So Tyrone Johnson loses his ability to teleport. Dagger steals Wolverine's motorcycle, and Tyrone jumps on the back and holds on to her, and they drive away. And again, Terminator-inspired scene. Remember in T2 when the T-1000 is like running after John Connor on a moped or whatever? Same thing, right? We just completely ripped that off. So Nimrod is chasing him on foot. And so Cloak and Dagger head back into New York City, and they're looking for anything at all that they could use to destroy Nimrod, kind of like a hydraulic press or a steel factory with molten metal that they could dip them in, you know, whatever. Back at the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, the NPC kids that are still there, they find a communicator, a Shi'ar communicator that the X-Men have in the mansion. And so they call the X-Men for help with this Nimrod situation, but the X-Men are up to their eyeballs in Brood. And by the way, if anybody doesn't know who the Brood are, basically imagine the xenomorph from the Aliens franchise, right? So Professor X, since they can't go to help physically, he uses telepathy to send a message to any mutants that he knows on Earth who are not members of the X-Men currently to try to lend a hand to Cloak and Dagger if they can. And this adventure, by the way, just it seemed to go on forever. And I could make this the most long-winded video ever, but suffice it to say, nothing that Cloak and Dagger tried at any point in the adventure worked even slightly. Which, if you think about it, is kind of how a Terminator movie goes, right? Like you shoot the Terminator and he's bulletproof, and you hit him with a thing and he gets back up. And it was like that. It really did. It just played out like a Terminator movie. So we get this big scene then where, because I was leaning into these cliches and stereotypes on purpose, where I'm trying to present the players with these familiar things to make them kind of nostalgic for movies and stuff like that they'd seen in the past. And at any rate, so there's this kind of trope that I've noticed where it's usually like a movie theater in New York, and like the part where you walk in is just like wide open. It's like this huge wide open lobby area that doesn't seem to have any front doors. And then usually the walls and ceiling and stuff in here is painted red, and they got these big spherical light bulbs everywhere. You know what I mean? Have you ever seen that in an old movie? That's how he described this thing, but it's an arcade, right? And so the sort of the big, and I had described a lot of things like a roller rink and stuff where I was pulling in ideas from my own childhood again to sort of appeal to the nostalgia of the players. And so the big kind of climactic grand finale thing takes place in this arcade. And Nimrod is like picking characters up and throwing them through arcade cabinets. And the cabinets aren't the most sturdy things ever, so they kind of splinter apart, and they're kind of made of crappy particle board and stuff like that anyways. And like tokens spill everywhere, and there's like random circuit boards and joysticks and broken glass from the screens, and you get the idea, right? People are screaming and running, and so on and so forth. And Nimrod, if you're imagining this in your mind's eye, Nimrod is made of like crystal, so he's like this pearlescent white crystal with kind of like a pinkish sheen to it, and so he's under all these lights are reflecting in his surface and stuff like that. And it seems like it'd be like a really cool movie. This is a movie I would like to watch myself, at any rate. So he's closing in on Dagger, and Cloak gets in between the two of them, and Cloak tells her to run. So she does, and she's got tears in her eyes, and she's running away. And then Nimrod kills Cloak. And we treat it kind of like the Kyle Reese thing at the end of the first Terminator movie, where he gives his life so that she can live. And there's this drug dealer out on the sidewalk, and he's watching all this go down, kind of wide-eyed. And he's on the phone telling someone, everything that he's seeing. And at any rate, Nimrod is closing in on Dagger. And she's firing, light dagger after light dagger to no avail. It's not working whatsoever. And by the way, Nimrod has Shift X endurance, amazing body armor, and an incredible force field. So the fact that the light daggers that Tandy Bowen throws only do excellent damage means that basically she has no hope of beating this guy unless she thinks of something outside the box. And in this one, she does not. So suddenly, an arcade token hits Nimrod, and it is actually moving faster than the speed of sound. So Nimrod takes damage, and he turns to look to see who finally managed to hurt him, right? And it's Quicksilver, who is a mutant that Xavier knows, who's not a current member of the X-Men, but he's still on Earth, and, he meets the criteria. So he's the one who showed up to lend a hand. And in DC Heroes, a speedster can throw an object that weighs 0 APs, which is 50 pounds, by the way. They can throw that equal to their super speed APs, right? So Quicksilver has 10 APs of super speed. So that means he could pick up something that weighs 50 pounds, and he can throw it at you at 10 APs of speed, right? If it weighed 1 AP, he could only throw at a speed of 9. If it weighed 2 APs, he can only throw that at a speed of 8. You know what I mean? But so at 0 APs, the object thrown does exactly the same amount of damage as the super speed, right? Here's the thing, though. If he picks up something that weighs only 25 APs, that means it weighs -1 AP. Wait, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If he picks up a thing that weighs 25 pounds, is what I meant to say, that would only weigh negative 1 AP. In DC Heroes, those negative APs are still an amount, right? So if he picked up something, because we're going to keep having it, right? If he picks up an object that weighs 12.5 pounds, then that means it weighs negative 2 APs. So then you take those 2 points that you're kind of getting back and you add that to your super speed. So now that means the thing that weighs 12.5 pounds, when Quicksilver throws it at you, it's going to do 12 APs of damage, right? He's actually doing more APs of damage than he has super speed. And it keeps going on like that. So the point is that these arcade tokens actually, and we just use the weight of a quarter in real life, that is negative 12 APs. So you take that 12 that you got back, basically, you add that to your 10 APs of speed, and that means Quicksilver can do 22 APs of damage when he's throwing quarters at you, right? Which is pretty awesome. So that's what he does. And he throws a lot of them. So we get this montage where Quicksilver is doing things so fast that it seems like the world is paused, basically. And he runs around picking up tokens that got scattered everywhere during the big arcade fight, and he's just winging them at Necron. And some of them ricochet off of the villain. So Quicksilver runs around and he grabs them and he's throwing them right back at him. And all the while, he's staying outside of the range of that neutralized field, right? And Nimrod realizes that if they keep this up, he's going to be destroyed. So when it's finally Nimrod's turn and he's starting to run low on hit points, he activates a gadget and he teleports away. And police sirens can be heard in the distance. So Quicksilver picks up Dagger, who's powerless for the moment, but after so many rounds, she's going to get her powers back because she's no longer exposed to that neutralized field anymore. And at any rate, so Quicksilver runs her back to the X-Mansion. And that brings us to the epilogue. So you remember the drug dealer on the payphone? It turns out he's one of the guys who works for Ecstasy. So he called her, and she actually arrived on the scene at the very end of the fight. And so she saw what Quicksilver was doing, and she saw Nimrod leave. She saw Quicksilver pick up Dagger and run her, to safety. And before the cops arrive, Ecstasy goes in and she takes Tyrone's cloak for herself, which is something that she had at one point in the comic books. So she uses the cloak then for evil purposes, and we haven't seen the last of her. But that, of course, is a story for another day. So this one was a weird one for multiple reasons. And for me to explain this in a way that makes any sense, I'm going to have to go back to the beginning. So before I took over as the game master in the mid-90s, my best friend in high school was our game master. And when we graduated, Jay joined the Army and moved away. But all of us guys who were playing the game, we loved the game and we didn't want it to end. So I took over as the new GM. And the first part of this adventure, which is what I refer to as the prologue, was actually a separate adventure. And it was one of the first adventures that I ever ran. And so I was extremely inexperienced. And that game session had 3 players at the time. Josh Boggs, his younger brother, John Boggs, and then this friend of theirs that was a foreign exchange student named Mache. And so Josh and John just show up one day and they say, Mache is going to play with us today, which is not how that goes. Typically, the GM approves new players, right? And they sit down and they talk ahead of time about what characters would or would not be appropriate, what power levels would or would not be appropriate, etc. What you do not do is tell the GM who's going to be playing in his game, whether he likes it or not, what character they're going to be playing, etc. And since I was new at it, I was like brand new at it back then, right? I let him push me around. And man, Mache was just a problem from the start. So even though on my end, I wanted to run a game inspired by the X-Men animated series, Mache insisted on playing Cloak, right? Who was not a member of the X-Men. Um, I wanted everybody to be an original character. My concept was going to be kind of like it's your first day of school at the Xavier school and stuff like that. And he, everybody else was playing original characters and he was playing an actual Marvel character. Um, and then not only did he tell me that he would be playing Cloak, he also told me that his dark dimension was just an absolute, that he was not going to have to roll for damage. That dimension would just instantly kill anything he put in there, no matter what. And Mache also informed me that he didn't have to roll dice to accomplish this. That any sort of like a grapple check or rolling to see if you hit or anything like that. Nope. He always did it automatically. It's always an absolute. And so I tried to explain to him at the time that I didn't even know what power in the rule book I would even use to represent that idea, right? Let alone how many points I had to charge him for doing it. And it's a point purchase system, which means the number of points that your character costs is that's the measurement the GM uses to try to make sure all the characters cost the same amount of points so that everything is balanced and everything is fair. But Mache just insisted on being a jerk. And I remember Josh just had this smile on his face, kind of like as if to say, like, yeah, we're doing this. So we did it. And Mache was annoying and rude every step of the way. And again, I was so inexperienced, and I could probably count on my fingers how many games I'd even ran before that one, right? I mean, and they were all bad games, by the way. I did not know what I was doing. So all that said, I decided as an inexperienced GM, I think I wrongly decided to kill off Cloak. And the reason I decided that was I would then make Mache play a different character, which is why I had Nimrod attack the Xavier school using neutralize, as I was trying to shut down that God mode thing that Mache had going on. And of course, instead of like getting into the game and trying to play a character who, he can't do what he normally does and he has to be creative and think of something else, he wasn't going for it. He was just a prick the whole time. So finally Cloak died, right? And by the way, I did not fudge any rolls. I just knew that Nimrod was a super tough opponent because I had played in games that Jay ran, where Jay sent Nimrod after my characters, and he was a problem. And by the way, I would think outside of the box. I would embrace the idea of, oh, there's this situation where I can't do the thing I normally do. Um, but yeah, I just had faith that Nimrod would get the job done, and he did. Um, as for Dagger, just as Cloak was like the favorite character of Mache, Dagger was one of the favorite characters of Dave Eckelberger. Dave and I had become friends in the 90s, and he pretty quickly became my best friend. And Dave was like the polar opposite of Mache, where if I used neutralize on a character that Dave was playing, he just got it, right? And he'd ask me, like, what's in the setting? Is there anything here that I could possibly use as a weapon? I look around, what's around me? Um, and that was cool. Um, and Dave sadly is not with us anymore. He passed away in 2009, but man, when he was around, I had some of the best gaming experiences I've ever had were with Dave. And he played Dagger quite a bit, actually. He was a big Dagger fan. And unlike Mache, if I made a ruling that Dave didn't like, Dave always saw the big picture, He always knew that we were hanging out and that the point was to try to have a good time. And he knew that fighting over alignment wasn't going to help that any. So So if Dave didn't like a call that I made, he would just nod and he'd be like, "That's cool, all right. I gotcha, I gotcha." And we'd just move on, you know? And then after a game, Dave was the kind of guy who'd like buy me a beer. And then he'd be like, "So you know that one rule? Here's how I see it, you know?" But he was always very chill about it. So again, he was the exact opposite of Mache. So I think it's funny that two such opposite players played Cloak and Dagger because to me, thematically, Cloak and Dagger are a little bit like yin and yang, you know what I mean? And then it was just weird because then the players were also like yin and yang, where they were very much opposite. So I thought that was really entertaining myself. Hopefully you found this also to be entertaining. If so, as always, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell, and leave us a comment. From all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.